everyone. I'm Emily Nunez.
I'm Iberdelion Rios.
I'm Alia Duca.
I'm Maria Velasquez.
And today we have come together as a Mutualista to engage in a thought experiment. We have been taking a look at the state of our country, and we, as well as most of you, have probably realized that we are in a very dire situation.
If we dive deeper and look at the current administration put in place, people have suffered and will continue to suffer. Moreover, if with all the damages and the systems that are currently put in place.
And then today, the job economy is really oversaturated and it's hard to find jobs, although there's a lot of people being qualified for the job.
Exactly. The economy is at a very low point. Us as a group of college students, we are all worried about what our job security is going to look like in the next few years, and the future is very uncertain. And so, amidst all of these problems that are ailing people across the country, we want to beg the question: is there an alternative world to this?
So, I personally believe there is. The only problem is I don't know how to get there, just because I know that there is a better way of doing this and I can see how that might look like in my head, and I'm sure that my peers do as well. But the problem is there's only so much that I can do, and there's only so much that we as a group can do. It really does matter on how the mass approves of these messages, and it's hard to imagine where some a place where everyone can agree on something. So, yeah, I believe there's a better way of doing things. I just don't know how to get there.
And that's why we've come together today. We wanted to engage in this thought experiment where we are going to create a utopian political economy and imagine what a better world could look like. But before we can imagine this better world, we can't help but wonder how it is that we got here. In a utopian universe where settler colonialism, slavery, and exploitation beyond repair of laborers and of the earth never happened, political economy would have looked simply more equal for everyone. How did we reach such a point where, according to the World Institute for Development Economics Research, the top 1% of richest individuals hoard 50% of the world's net wealth, and the top 10% of rich people own 85% of the world's wealth? That leaves 15% of the globe's remaining assets left to be distributed across 90% of the population. The American capitalist rhetoric around these alarming statistics is that the multimillionaires and billionaires in the country built and worked for their wealth from the ground up, just like anyone else has the opportunity to do so in a free market. But before we fall for that propaganda, let's remember that these wealthy powers didn't build their wealth themselves. They exploited the labor of countless others, paying their employees cents on the dollar and profiting wildly disproportionately, such as Jeff Bezos facing tens of millions of dollars in Amazon wage theft lawsuits. They come from generations of exploiters, such as Elon Musk's father's side, having owned emerald mines in South Africa and been political supporters of apartheid. Meanwhile, as of 2024, nearly 800,000 Americans are homeless on any given night, and 36 million are living in extreme poverty. And that's with the definition of poverty being defined as less than $32,000 a year for a family of four, which indicates to us that poverty in the US is actually much, much worse than what's on record. I circle the question here: how did we get to this point of normalizing and even defending such massive disparities of wealth and hoarding of American wealth? And the answer goes all the way back to the beginnings of the rise of mainstream and globalized economy itself. In the earliest stages of mankind and society, hunter-gatherer groups were egalitarian, and life was based on subsistence and survival. The turning point when it comes to classist history actually comes along when these early peoples discovered agriculture and the cultivation of their food sources at a larger scale. And with the upscale in agriculture, societies began cultivating food in surplus, not only for their own subsistence, but instead for profit by distribution and sale. And along with agriculture came a new need for the division of labor to contribute to these larger production processes. Labor and production beyond the nomadic hunter-gatherers' needs led to a transition from communal property to private property. And suddenly, if certain individuals or families are laboring to cultivate a plot of land, they feel a sense of ownership and lay claim to that land, not only the fruit it bears. And this labor, not only for the production of one's personal needs, but for surplus commodities, introduces the concept of wages, compensating laborers with a wage other than the actual product that they've produced. The moment wage labor replaced personal subsistence labor, the exploitation of these laborers for disproportionate and unfair wages immediately followed. This would lead to the first accumulations of wealth for those employing and overseeing these agricultural projects, who, go figure, are the same families who own property and land, and conversely, a relative poverty ailing the exploited laborer. And these emergent disparities in wealth became mainstream when the globalization of the economy really took place. Trade routes that crossed international borders, such as the Silk Road or popular straits and canals across the Mediterranean and Red Seas, these allowed for merchant and bourgeoisie classes to emerge when players dedicated themselves to accumulating wealth instead of being born into either a peasant or a noble class. Marx discusses these developments extensively in his Critique on Capitalism essay, as does Rousseau in his Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. And this was the beginning of capitalism as we know it, and directly relates to the colonial history that Ever will later discuss. So, the exploitative labor practices and the wealth disparities grown from them, they've been a long time in the making. So much so that it's hard to even imagine anything outside of these oppressive and unjust constructs. As Americans, we can hardly believe in a possibility for life outside of slaving away as a wealth-generating pawn, making the rich richer. But that's why we're here today, contemplating the political and economic structures of our world, speculating over why things are the way that they are today, and deconstructing these ancient institutions that define our fates. All this in order to reconstruct an alternative, a utopian political economy from our imaginations, a thought experiment that might just provoke some of us to move differently going forward, with a higher end for our lives and society in mind.
I really like the comment that you made about hunter-gatherers groups and how land belongs to everyone. And it reminded me a lot of the play The Cherokee Night by Lynn Riggs, and how indigenous communities viewed land as something shared and not owned. Because it wasn't until white settlers introduced the idea of claiming property that indigenous people started getting persecuted for taking land, and they believe it belonged to everyone. At one point in the play, one of the characters mentions how his father was persecuted and punished for stealing food from the land he saw as open and available to everyone.
Yeah, I remember in that exact scene, one of the things that he had said was that his father didn't even know what stealing was because it wasn't a concept they were accustomed to. He wasn't stealing the food; he was just taking food that he had every right to, just like anyone else. And so it shows what a foreign and made-up concept property was to the indigenous communities in the area.
As Emily put it greatly, our economic structure has been put together and established for centuries. And as United States citizens, we do not know anything different from tight-rooted capitalism. But where does that established system come from? And it resorts to the consequences of large-scale imperial colonialism from the British to the French, and even including the Italians, who dominated the world from country to country and ocean to ocean. Colonialism is defined as the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. In the United States, it was ever prevalent as the now mega-power country that held such immense power on a global scale was a little small British colony that endured the sufferings of imperialism, from the tax on tea imploding into the old creed of no taxation without representation, to all-out war for independence from monarchy rule. The United States is no stranger to the unfair and unequal treaty that comes from being ruled by a foreign entity that now they are the ones heralding in colonial rule on other nations, with such examples as Puerto Rico and Guam, which are under direct political control of the United States without any of the constitutional rights that mainland U.S. citizens have. America, a country built on independence and the rights of man, has become a nation of dominance, and instead of spreading the notions of freedom that it believes so highly in, which is baked into its very decree of independence, has become a country of oppression through overarching rule, relapsing the cycle of oppression through colonial rule, this now giant country was born from.
Yeah, I appreciate the comment that you made on how the US today has become a colonial power itself, despite its own beginnings as a colonized territory. And it reminds me of one bit of literature that I read in class. It was a chapter out of Maria Josefina Saldaña Portillo's book, The Revolutionary Imagination in the Americas and the Age of Development. And she discusses development as basically a new wave of colonialism or neocolonialism, as we've heard it termed as of late. And this is basically economic colonization of other territories instead of settler colonization. And so, although it's not quite to the same extent of settler colonial horrors and the enslavement of colonized peoples. However, it's still an external superpower setting up and taking advantage and exploiting the resources of another territory under the guise of post-war development. And so we see the United States heavily engaged in neocolonialism across the world and especially in Latin America.
Yeah, so for me, going to school felt like a system was prepping our growing minds for what the world would eventually end up like. So we would go to school from 9 a.m. to almost 4 p.m. And it just felt like I was getting ready for a 9 to 5 office job for my whole life, but I do not want that to be the case. And a lot of people of our generation don't, which is why there's so many influencers and small businesses for this reason. People want that free will. And for me, I personally wanted to be an author or an artist or some career path that sort of got me a few looks whenever I eventually became a little bit older. So, what about you guys? What were y'all's ideal careers?
I think as a kid, I always wanted to play like professional soccer. Um, but as you grow up and as you grow in high school, you're always told, "Hey, that's probably not a real possibility," which in hindsight is probably true. But um, creativity and dreams are not really fostered or fed into as you're growing up. You're more told, hey, study law or go study medicine, especially growing up as a kid in high school or middle school.
Yeah, I actually faced this exact same problem. As a kid, I wanted to be an actress when I grew up, and I spent 8 years in middle school and high school doing theater. Like it was my whole life, competing, whatever. But as soon as college applications rolled around, and I started to dabble in the idea, hey, maybe I want to major in acting or performance, the reaction from everybody was that's a horrible idea, it's not worth it, that's not a real career, and all of the same topics. So now I'm currently on a pre-law track and have sold my soul to going into the corporate world. And I too hope for a future where either I can have my own practice or basically, yeah, have that independence that Alia was talking about that we all want. The whole concept of being your own boss, to have some kind of escape from having to work 9 hour days for someone else.
Yeah, in today's society, I feel like we've all been funneled to take one path. They always told us, we are the future of the world, and now we're going to be the future actors, soccer players, artists. But then once we get a little older, sort of like what happened to Emily in Deliver, um, professions such as doctor or engineer got a lot more praise than other professions. And in this journal, Mia Perry and Diane Collier mention how creativity isn't universal, predictable, or easy to define. It's shaped by time and context, and standardized education doesn't really accommodate to individuality well. And many creative opportunities in school are superficial because once you've lived 18 years, a good 13, 14 years in school at that point, you're expected to go to more school. And if you're planning on going to law school or if you're pre-med or dental school, you go to more school and are expected to work hours on end for a paycheck that does not even hold as much value as it did 20 years ago. The thought itself seems very tiring, which is why so many want to own their own businesses. The article gives light to the idea that people want free will because creativity thrives in self made environments, not the corporate ones. I myself want to own my future business, further affirming how I also want that free will.
Aaliyah, I also noticed the notion of so many people wanting to own their own businesses. And today, a lot of people want to be their own boss because it feels like the best way to experience freedom in their life. And sometimes people argue that entrepreneurship gives them more control over their life, lets them work from anywhere, even from home if they wanted to, and that they can make way much more money than a 9 to 5 while working the same amount of hours if they stayed in their regular 9 to 5 job. And thanks to social media, this belief is more widespread because the content from major social media apps such as TikTok, Instagram, X, or Twitter and YouTube romanticizes being a business owner and makes it seem like the best way to attain success, since it constantly shows people who made it, but it rarely shows the failures. The reality is much more complicated as to what is shown in social media because most businesses fail because of oversaturation, since everyone thinks they will be the exception who makes it and become a millionaire. And because social media doesn't show the cons, like the frauds that happen within companies, the instability, and how much responsibility you have to take as an owner, people don't really see the full picture of what it is being an owner. And if these realities do get shown, they usually don't get much interaction because people want to consume content that gives them hope that there's something better than the everyday routine of a 9 to 5. In reality, most business owners are not millionaires, and entrepreneurship doesn't guarantee more time or more freedom. In a lot of cases, entrepreneurs actually have less flexibility because everything depends on them. They are responsible for themselves, for the workers who keep the company running, and for the constant effort it takes to keep the entire business afloat. And that accountability is something people don't talk about in the fantasy of becoming an entrepreneur because just like anything else, new challenges arises and new pressures appear. Another thing is that the idea that entrepreneurship is somehow easier or more lucrative than a 9 to 5 isn't true for most people. The major appeal is really the hope of making more money, but the risk is high. People invest money into their own companies and often make no return because the outcome is never guaranteed. And since there isn't a stable paycheck being transferred every month, many people end up going into bankruptcy, but even with all this risk, the desire to be your own boss keeps growing.
Yeah, I've also observed a lot of what you're describing here. I know families who have gone bankrupt because their business went under. I know a good family friend living even in Spain, even outside of the country, that their first business went under even after lots of investments from themselves, from other family friends, and they had to start from scratch. They work upwards of 80 hours a week sometimes just to maintain their business. And so it's not all sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah, despite the reality, there are a lot of current studies showing that around 60% of Americans share the desire to become their own boss, which makes sense when you think about how the job market has been changing since the early 2010s. Today, we have a combination of the 9 to 5 and the be your own boss mindset where people technically work for someone else, but their job functions like they're self employed. This is the case for independent drivers who work for companies such as Uber Eats, DoorDash, and Amazon Flex. People think that it's freedom because they can pick their own schedule, choose which days to work, and avoid a traditional boss. But in reality, that freedom has its cost. Due to the current state of our economy, most workers use multiple apps at the same time in order to actually make a decent living since there is so much oversaturation and competition. So my question is this what jobs look like now? It's no longer the traditional 9 to 5, but it's also not full entrepreneurship. It's a mixture of both flexibility without stability, and this shows how the dream of being your own boss is shaping the way people work today, even when they're still technically working under bigger companies.
Yeah, going off of what you said, Maria, like when people sign up for these jobs that are part of a bigger company yet allow them to act like their own boss, such as Uber, they also give up benefits like 401ks and Medcare, and just how much are they gaining and how much are they really losing? Because, a little scratch that can land you in the hospital will probably take up a few paychecks. So it's also a way to also dig yourself in deeper.
Exactly. And building off of that, I, for instance, I'm familiar with DoorDash and Uber Eats and apps like those and have experimented with them. And the pay is nothing to get excited about. You're making oftentimes the bulk of what you're making is solely based off of the tip that these people who are making orders give you. And the app itself is paying you literal cents or $1 to drive, numerous miles. You're ending up spending more money on gas than what the app is paying you. And tips are optional. So if people decide that they don't want to tip you, you didn't make any money on that order, and it is what it is. And so there are a lot of inconveniences and really just unfair wages, even with these more independent apps.
With all these conflicts within our current day society being laid out, there is a need to deconstruct a number of these institutions to what would be a sensible political and economic society, dissecting the stronghold of religion, the places and roles of the taxpayer system, the disheveled incarceration system, and the complicated role of the military. I'll be focusing on the role of religion and its use for imperial rule. While colonialism held a strong hold on many rural territories, one of the main ways in which these major European powers were able to hold such control in what was the New World and in the Americas and places in Africa or Asia has been the infusion of European religions into these conquered territories, from Christianity being brought to what became the United States, from the British to Catholicism being transferred over by the Spanish and infused into the rule of Central American territories. Religion has been a huge byline and structure to control masses of individuals. Taking a look at the class literature using Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and one of my clerical summaries, I stated that religion in this text serves as a double-edged sword. From the Anecdotes of Jacobs, it becomes a tool for hope, but it's also the weapon used against enslaved people. God and religion in the narrative becomes weaponized by the enslavers, which in short, if the slave and the slave master are praying to the same God, whose prayers will God eventually hear first? Those in control or those without? Looking at the role of religion through a Marxist lens, Karl Marx has been quoted as saying, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, and the soul of the soulless condition. It is the opium of the people." Marx made it clear that while religion has its place in society, it has been used by those in power to justify their unjust rule by playing the card of religion and purity through an entity, while employing a horrifying and corrupt economic system through capitalism that has stripped away the rights and the freedoms of citizens.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement, Ever, that we've seen religion being used as a weapon against colonized peoples throughout history over and over again. And one example that I'm thinking about is the Carlisle Indian boarding schools, or indigenous boarding schools that were that were popping up across the country. In these schools, they were one of the curriculum was teaching these indigenous children the white man's religion and Christianity, and it was just a way to pacify them and get them to become obedient, because there's a lot of rhetoric around obedience, turning the other cheek, and accepting your station in life. And there's also religious rhetoric around how certain populations are being punished by God for some sin that was committed a long time ago, and that is why these peoples are subject to slavery. As we're discussing the types of corrupt institutions that have taken hold throughout the years in the US, I wanted to touch on the police and prison system in the United States. It's one of the most corrupt and major institutions in the US that couldn't remotely exist in the same way in our utopian political economy that we're trying to imagine. You may have heard people describe our incarceration systems as for profit prisons. And what that means is that both the government and private jailing corporations that collaborate with the state and federal governments actually have monetary incentives to pursue mass incarceration instead of investing in reformative or rehabilitating programs. When the state commits to a contract with a private facility for jailing, they effectively rent thousands of beds and cells from them. Of course, these private companies thus capitalize off of the criminalization of Black and Brown communities, evidenced by their constant construction of new, larger jailing facilities, as if it were as simple as real estate and filling new apartment complexes. The government, in turn, profits off of mass incarceration in a number of different ways. For one, they're able to have incarcerated folk work for next to nothing wages, uncompelled by minimum wage laws within the prisons. It's quite the recall back to the practice of convict leasing and prison chain gangs during the Jim Crow era in the southern United States, where the state would criminalize just about everything black men could do in order to incarcerate them and lease them out to paying customers, a blatant continuation of slavery under the guise of criminal punishment. If people think that those times are behind us, they are deeply mistaken. One stock market study conducted by Gabriela Badmus found that private prison corporations, or PPCs, profit off of restrictive immigration policies, and conversely, they see their stock prices drop when they're faced with sanction threats or reformative policy promises. Amidst the current deportation and detention crisis ailing immigrants across the country, over 90% of detainees are being held in custody at private detention facilities, meaning that these facilities are profiting more than ever off of Trump's unprecedented budget increases for ICE and the mass deportation agenda. The deal made between Trump and the PPCs is clear. The two largest private immigration detention companies, CoreCivic and Geo Group, donated millions to Trump's 2024 campaign, and the Trump administration still sees donation stipends for every single detainee's tax allocation, money that is coming directly from taxpayers to the Trump administration. The bottom line here is that as long as the country profits off of mass incarceration, they will criminalize minorities and orchestrate desperate conditions for low-income communities in order to increase crime rates and incarcerate more people. As long as we have for-profit prisons, the prison system will remain corrupt, and its interests are forever going to be pitted against the good of the communities they're supposed to keep safe. And on the subject of corrupt institutions meant to protect people, we can't gloss over the police system in this country. According to the independent organization Mapping Police Violence, United States law enforcement officers have murdered 1,200 people in 2025 alone. The worst part is that there are hardly any consequences for police murders. No jail time, no fines, and sometimes not even termination. A slap on the wrist is all. Perhaps switch jurisdictions despite the blood of innocent youth on their hands. From 2020 to 2024, there were 742 killings by police officers in Central Texas alone. Countless of those killings occurred toward unarmed youth, many of them experiencing mental health crises and not having committed any crime at all. The police system in this country is immensely abusive, violent, and internally corrupt, with zero accountability and poor training nationwide. And handing weapons and endless get-out-of-jail-free cards to bigoted individuals in need of a power trip is a recipe for disaster. Law enforcement are just another agency to maintain the oppressive political economy that we see today, and they couldn't continue to exist in our utopia.
I'm gonna go off what Emily says about ICE and the police. I see so many videos online about how ICE operates, and they fully use stereotypes and don't try hiding it. And my question is, how are we supposed to let this slide and police brutality slide when it is the very victims of Great Britain that now hold the power, and they only have that power because they got upset at Great Britain doing the same exact things that are going on now. Police brutality has always been here. In 2020, there was a Black Lives Matter movement, and I learned a lot during this time, more about our policing systems and more on how this is a pattern that has been going on for a long time. And a story that kind of stuck with me was Breonna Taylor's. She was murdered in her own home by 3 policemen who entered without a warrant. And in this journalist, Jordan Martin goes into depth about how the murder of Breonna Taylor and how Black women have always been neglected by the government and the law, broken up in segments talking about how Black women being neglected by law enforcement and government led to the defund movement, or it didn't lead it, but it supported defunding the police. And I know it's not all police, but the system itself. There are a few services some provide, like ones I've seen on TikTok, a diving company that goes into rivers and lakes looking for missing persons. They give the families the closure that is needed, but they also keep their empathy and compassion near. Which this leads me to talk about how these similar services are self-funded or fully commissioned for, yet doing more than our police forces, because on these videos that they post, I see comments such as, "I'm not surprised the police gave up on these people. So we must hold people accountable for these actions. And to talk a little bit more about the system itself, a lot of police funding goes to equipment and salaries, which is important, but training is also just as important. And in 2021, most police departments use 96% of their funding on salaries and benefits, leaving very little for training. I believe more funding should be going into training and mental health facilities to help our police, because for them to help us, they need to be helped as well. Anger management classes, therapy, and correct training for police might help them, and by doing so, us too. However, it seems that there are so many things wrong with the current system that to imagine a corrected one seems so far away. The system doesn't just stop at police departments, it runs deep in the root of this country's government. It goes as far as the military, maybe even beyond.
With the police being a state funded institution, it makes you wonder, where are our tax dollars going? They're going into the salaries and benefits of these murderous, abusive police officers. When I personally would rather my tax dollars be going toward organizations like Alia mentioned, that are actually doing good for the community and aren't self serving and aren't on this crazy power trip where they are seen abusing individuals every day, every night in 6th Street and across Austin. And so a reallocation of tax money could be one answer to solving some of our problems.
Right. And if we look at the military specifically, the numbers really show how complex the system is. Recently, the number of people enlisting in the US Army has been increasing. For instance, in 2024, the US Army Recruiting Command reported that 55,150 people enlisted in the regular army, which actually exceeded their goal of 55,000 for the year. That's a pretty big shift compared to 2022, when recruitment fell 25% short of the target that they had. And after the drop, the Army launched a series of new strategies to boost enlistment. They created the Future Soldier Preparatory Course and increased their marketing and advertisement budget. One of the approaches they used was creating ads specifically for Spanish speakers, and in some cases, those ads were even aimed at Spanish speaking parents rather than students. Young men are also targeted by military recruiters during school hours because schools risk losing funding if they do not provide access to students' information. And although parents can decline, many families are not fully aware of this option, which puts students in a position where they can be easily approached. This continues today in the way that the military focuses on high school students, specifically those from low income communities who have fewer resources and are more likely to be influenced by promises of financial stability. They oftentimes get sold the idea that joining the military is the right path to pay for college, serve their community, and learn valuable skills. And I know it has been a few years since we graduated high school, but did you guys ever experience this too? Did military recruitment show up at your school? And what was it like?
I actually did see, I do remember very vividly, like the pull up bar that they set up in our cafeteria. And I think a friend of a friend I saw doing a lot of pull ups. And I think I made the joke to my little group I was walking with, like, you better watch out or they're gonna be knocking at his door, because he was past 20, like he was going up there. And it was just like a little silly joke, but like they really could.
I mean, yeah, I saw it all the time too. I personally come from a more underprivileged community. My high school is most usually more um, minority oriented. So, and then military recruiters would come all the time, especially like my senior year. Recruiters were felt like they were there just about every week, passing out flyers, like goodie bags, all of which enticing these some of my classmates. So, hey, joining this is going to help you out. And it always all felt a little weird, especially when you find out that every U.S. citizen male who has, whenever they turn 18, has to sign up for something that's called the selective service, which is essentially if the U.S. was ever to go to war and was in need of a draft, that every male has to sign up for that, and you get assigned a card with a number, and then if your number's ever called, well, now you have to gear up, and go to war for some reason. Um, so it felt like a really backward system that I think it's safe to say that still exists from day to day in schools today.
Yeah, same here. I saw military recruiters at my school frequently, and my school was also really big on the ROTC program, as I know like so many high schools do across the state. And it's just, getting students accustomed to seeing their fellow students wearing military uniforms, seeing them marching, seeing them holding batons, seeing them mimic what the military looks like. And it's exactly what Maria said. They are preying on low income students who don't know what they want to do after high school, and it's this option of like, okay, I can get some benefits without even deeply considering what are you serving, what are you fighting for, what is going to be asked of you. There's so many questions that these young people don't know, and also giving giving the option to acquire papers to legalize yourself is very manipulative, because this is some people's only option, and so I think it's very sneaky the way that they recruit.
Going off of that, I actually have like again another friend of a friend, and her dad wasn't legal, and he recently just filed for citizenship just because both I personally wasn't aware of this law, but if you have like a child that's U.S. citizen for like 18 years, I think, you can get your citizenship somehow that way. Yeah. But yeah, that they tried doing that, and like I think he's detained by ICE right now. Like his daughter is fully a college student, like has been a U.S. citizen for 18 years at least, but they still detained him. So yeah, like it just are they helping or are they trying to get more people?
Yeah. To respond to that, currently ICE is really going after a lot of people that are in the middle of becoming legalized, and they're in the middle of their legalization processes. They have asylum hearings, they have citizenship tests coming up, and they are on them. They are trying to get them before they're legal, and so it just shows that they have no interest in giving people the right path and making sure people are legalized. They actually just want to clear them from the country.
I remember like thinking um that I was just like so grateful one day that my parents got their citizenship during Obama's term. It was still hard. I remember a lot of my free time in like the car was spent not on the radio but like listening to the questions. Um but like, they passed during Obama and I'm like forever grateful for it because genuinely I don't know how hard it would have been to get it now.
For me personally, I do want to add that I am like, my parents are both immigrants. So it is, today's day and age, it is kind of scary when they go a lot, they go outside, especially with like ice raids happening far too often. And then to get back with the military promises, if your family are immigrants, it promises them a pathway to citizenship. Um, but I always tell myself personally, why would I fight for a country that not necessarily will fight for me? So why would I lay my life down for a country that would never sacrifice itself for myself?
Yeah, Wilbur, I agree. So many promises are being made. For instance, many applicants who want to pursue higher education join with the hope of getting their college tuition paid for. But this only happens if the individual receives a full honorable discharge. However, only about 77% receive that type of discharge. The rest receive discharges such as general or medical, which makes it harder for them to access the full benefits they believe they earn, causing some to fall into student debt. And another issue with the military is the racial and ethnic discrimination. discrimination experienced in training camps and throughout service. For example, a survey conducted by the Blue Star family found that 34% of veterans view racial and ethnic discrimination as a factor when deciding whether they should stay or leave the military.
So, to recap what we've gone over in today's episode, we talked about various institutions that are harming the US and harming our political economy, as well as the histories that brought us to the unjust political economy that we see today. And after reflecting on all of the different causes and reasons behind the way that the inequalities that we face in our lives, we have kind of deconstructed all of these elements. And next episode, we're going to come together and reconstruct and world build to imagine a utopian political economy. Thanks for listening. This was Emily Nunez.
Iver de Leon Rios.
Alia Duca.
And Maria Velasquez.